scouts found a convoy of laborers on their way to Winterhome. But they had lost their way and were out of fuel. So the scouts decided to escort them to our settlement. Otherwise, their fate would have been unenviable, especially as we could never use laborers. At the same moment, another party reached a cave not far from the shelter, where they found people cornered by bears. Our brave boys killed the predators at the cost of their lives, thus saving these travelers. The dying scouts told us where to go, and the survivors went to our house according to the maps taken from the scouts. The coal reserves left by the builders had already begun to run out, so the research center was tasked with developing blueprints for the construction of coal mines to establish a constant supply of this necessary resource. A week after we arrived here, we had already settled it, established the infrastructure, set up the necessary production facilities, settled around the generator, and our number was already an impressive 148 people. In order not to wait for the right opportunity, the Council of Doctors together with the captain decided in advance that radical surgery methods would be used in case of serious health problems to try to return each person to normal life and work. Although there is a possibility of being disabled, the Council assumed that in the future we will be able to deal with this problem. The next achievement was the introduction of drafting machines, so that our engineering corps could more fully utilize the tools available to develop technology. The city continued to expand. Additional tents and refugee quarters were built, because we already had an escort team of workers headed for the winter home. In this way, a small workers' town had already formed around the steelworks, which would be heated locally. Steel reserves had long been exhausted, and our minds were given the task of solving this problem and putting the city on the rails of self-sufficiency in the shortest possible time. There was a small iron deposit near our borders, so our first steel-making plant was up and running quite quickly, although the production technology still needed to be finalized. In the same way, a small town had also sprung up near the coal mines. The reserves of coal that had been left behind were now completely depleted, and this was the start of the commissioning of new mines to continue to power our generator. Upon learning of the arrival of new survivors, the Hunters Guild also expanded, erecting additional huts from where they would conduct their raids. By this time, we had our first amputee, so our captain gave the order to build a separate house to care for the disabled, whom we wanted to get back into service by any means possible. One such poor fellow got on the operating table and started screaming and wouldn't let the doctors operate, but the men forced him to accept the inevitable to keep him alive. Later he sent a note thanking us for not letting him die. Meanwhile, our scouts had reached Winterhome Weather Station, but for some reason no one had been there for a long time. But Winterhome was visible from the roof. This discovery caused lively conversations about the fact that it looked as if we would not see anything good further on. Some people said that we should not have come here. There were real houses in London, not tents and wooden boxes. When our scouts finally reached the neighboring town, they saw a terrible picture. The buildings were destroyed. Dead bodies were visible. The generator was blown up. In the chronicles, it was written that the food ran out and rebellions began, which later turned into anarchy and fights for resources between the inhabitants. And eventually, those who did not leave Winterhome died from infighting, or from hunger and cold. The middle entry was God has forgotten us. We devour our dead. There is no hope anymore. This news shocked every citizen in our town. We assumed that there would be towns near us where people would live normal lives, heated by generators, but it seems that we are alone here. The fall of Winterhome sent panic through our ranks. People were outraged. Some were losing their speech and some started talking about moving back to London. There was nothing left for our captain to do but to give purpose. to give meaning, to give an answer to the question of why we are here. And yet, in order not to become fanatics, our captain chose the only right choice, so as not to descend into anarchy as in Winterhome. The captain introduced civilian patrols that would keep order in the city and especially in the residential neighborhoods, watching the streets from towers. But a crowd was already gathering. They came to the captain and argued about the path they had chosen, tried to convince him to go back. They gave an ultimatum that they would leave in 15 days and take with them those who wanted to try their luck in London. They looked frightened, but still the commander was not frightened by the conflict. He vowed that he would do his best and they would stay. Still, the captain was very worried about the future of the city. He did not know what was ahead of them, but he believed and hoped for the best. He believed that he could keep the city under control and could bring hope and order back into their hearts. At the same time, scouts on the Badlands were finding groups of starving people in the vicinity of Winterhome who had fled there during the anarchy. They were exhausted from cold and hunger, and there was some suspicion that they had eaten the fallen to survive. But we didn't dare put it to them, because you never know what we would have done in their place. So the scout troop was given the command to escort any survivors they found back to us, no matter what. Not far from the same camp, a group of children were found who had previously been taken out of Winterhome by their teachers to a secluded cave to have any chance of survival. Luckily for them, our scouts escorted them home as well. Unfortunately, a man who had his limbs amputated due to frostbite decided to commit suicide, unable to withstand the blow of fate, although our engineers had already developed solutions for such people. But whatever it was the first suicide death in our settlement. To mitigate this situation, the command decided to establish a cemetery on the outskirts of the crater. People continued to join the grouping of Londoners, convincing the others that this was the only sure way to escape. To reduce the escalation of this phenomenon, the captain ordered the construction of sentinel towers to keep order in the streets and help their comrades. In addition, we began to improve housing conditions, thus showing that we have the resources and strength to build a strong, independent city, able to ensure not only survival, but also the growth of normal human comfort, despite the world cataclysm. Of course, it is not the same conditions that were in London, but it is no longer tense in any houses that will not blow the wide. Renovation of housing started from the outskirts, where the heat from the generator did not reach, in order to protect people from unnecessary frostbite. Gradually, we will demolish all the tents and build more comfortable barracks in their place. By the way, the last coal reserves left by the workers builders of the generator were exhausted, but fortunately we had already developed coal mines and the fuel supply was uninterrupted from lenses under the crater surface by our brave miners and steam engines. But no matter how hard we tried, the discontent in the city continued to grow. Our commander promised that within a few days he would settle the situation and make decisions to make life easier for the citizens, for we had the strength to do so. By the 12th day, the city had already grown considerably, numbering to 148 citizens of our brave and presumably last hotbed of civilization. Since, in the near future, it was planned to increase the capacity of the generator to heat more houses, as well as to create coal reserves. It was decided to establish a new mining sector, and with the help of pumps, fossil fuel deposits would be brought to the surface, where at the extraction points they would be collected by working hands, mostly children, so hauling sacks was the safest enterprise for them. In the wake of the recent incident of a man committing suicide, we didn't want a repeat of such situations, so a decree was issued that all people who lost limbs would receive prosthetic limbs created and designed in our factories. The creation of watchtowers has already paid off. The sentries prevented a tragedy when they rescued a boy who had climbed onto a generator and could have died. The captain was happy to hear that his decision had already saved the life of one small child at least. The complex of taken measures and decisions has reduced the degree of discontent among the inhabitants, which gave them hope that we are going in the right direction and our commander will properly manage the power given to him. Not far from the camp where we found the starving people from Winter Home, a scouting party found bones and bodies of unburied people, which looked like they had been eaten in that camp. The scouts buried them so that their souls would finally find peace in a better place than this cold world. In addition, an American camp was found to the northeast of our city. The people there were already dead, but many of them were wearing prosthetic limbs of a quality never seen before even in the Empire. The prosthetic limbs bore the mark of Nikola Tesla's company. Not far from this camp was found another one, in the center of which was found a monument in honor of people sacrificed in the name of progress, whatever that means. At the next destination were found still alive people, also escaped from the Tesla settlement. They were already almost dead. No doubt we were the last hope for their survival, especially since we could never use labor. The mining pumps had already started work on extracting the coal from beneath the surface of the crater, giving us an extra supply of fuel for the generator. In the center of our town, some unknown Londoner got up on a platform and began to preach his ideas that we should all leave the town and agitated for the decadence of the inhabitants. But nevertheless, we were gracious enough to let him speak, hoping for the prudence of our people. However, a group of Londoners became more and more active and open, and began to pose a real threat to the city. They painted various inscriptions on the walls of the houses, in which the thread was that the expedition was doomed. The council sent out sentries to erase these writings. With a faction of Londoners becoming more and more aggressive towards the command in the city, it was decided to expand the law enforcement apparatus and build guard stations, giving the people who work for them full militia powers to deter dangerous actions by some citizens, as well as to stop the growing criminal activity. Our production efficiency grew, coal production increased, our city grew, and new warehouses began to be built on the unheated outskirts of the crater to increase the amount of resources we needed in case of shortages or other threats to secure our survival. A guard station had already been built and some of the residents volunteered to become defenders of order, donning militia uniforms to help their new homeland withstand the hard times. And here was another act of vandalism. But by this time we were ready for any development of events and promptly began to wash off the inscriptions discrediting our captain. However, the watchman sent to remove them was beaten up. This was the first full-fledged crime in our city, so the militia began to guard and patrol the streets of the city to prevent such offenses. In the meantime, the scouts had discovered a fishing village within a frozen pond from which fish could be caught. It seemed to be used to supply food to the city of Tesla, and from the records of some of the former inhabitants of the village, it was clear that the city of Tesla had become a dictatorship and was ruling the lives of the people with such recklessness that it was frightening to believe that this man had once been the light of civilization. But now he was a madman who was throwing people into the frozen wasteland to die. Recovering further along the trail leading from this fishing village, the city of Tesla was found. It looked very technologically advanced from the outside, with electrical discharges sniffing everywhere, but it seemed to be empty, for no one had met the scouts when they arrived there. It seems that the electricity that was running discharges all over the city had killed almost the entire population, or worse, the entire city, and the scouts didn't risk going in as they could smell the smell of burning flesh that seemed to come from the poor people that were lying in the snow. Our scouts didn't risk their lives and just walked on. Walking a little further, they found a dreadnought frozen in the ice, on which the Americans had come. A little further on, the scouts saw smoke from fires on a rock. When they reached there, they came upon men armed with rifles, clearly prepared for a confrontation, even though they were obviously exhausted. The scouts tried to talk to them to show that they had no hostile intentions. After talking, the Americans did lower their weapons. They told us that they had done justice to Tesla, who had gone mad with power. In the end, we offered to go to our settlement, after which they buried the body of the inventor and moved to the shelter. There were still many places to visit in this vicinity, such as another American dreadnought, but for the most part they were no longer of much interest to us, except for resources. At this moment, our engineering and research centers received new equipment, computing machines, with the help of which our engineers will be able to reach even greater heights in the development of our great mission, which undoubtedly gave hope for the future. Another propagandist of Londoners gathered people in the square, where he frightened them with various scary stories to lure them into his faction, but the police worked quickly and chased them away with his speeches. Also, to unite the society, a proposal was made to gather in the morning in the square before work in shifts to voice goals, objectives, achievements, and victories. In solidarity, people from the streets began bringing hot soup to the guards to keep them warm during cold shifts. During frequent acts of vandalism, the guardsmen began to patrol the streets of the city on a regular basis. Another victory, testifying to the effectiveness of our rule, was the introduction of new technologies for smelting steel. Now, even more of this valuable resource began to flow into the vaults. And once again, the Londoners showed their nefarious nature by stealing supplies intended for workers returning from hard shifts for the benefit of the last outpost of mankind. But the brave militia had already gone to investigate the incident and look for the culprits. Nevertheless, the city needed more innovation, and in response, a new research wing was established on the outskirts. Another disgruntled person started to muddy the lake of our tranquility, but the militiamen forced him to shut up. Another thief who tried to steal supplies was not released, but in fact he tried to steal the future from civilization, and his fate lay in the hands of the angry inhabitants. The sight of the crowd's actions gave the idea of entertaining the people, and we introduced the possibility of fighting in makeshift arenas where tired people could vent their anger on their neighbors. For the first time since the Londoners appeared and began to gain popularity with their false decadent speeches, their numbers began to decline, thanks to decisive action. Thanks to our bright minds in the engineering departments, we introduced the production of improvised airships in the factories and supplied them to the hunters, because the game in the vicinity was noticeably reduced. And for better food supply, the Guild of Hunters officially began to call themselves Sky Reapers, reaching the previously unreachable habitats of animals. During a patrol, the boy gave his toy puppy to a watchman, thanking him for the safe streets. By now, we could reliably say that our future was now in sight. We have secured ourselves both from the lack of resources and from the sick people leading us to the abyss by a valiantly duty-bearing guard that protects the peace and order of the city's streets. The numbers of Londoners will gradually decline until all reasonable people have left their decadent faction. The captain could proudly declare that he had taken the helm in his strong hands with the determination of a lion and was leading the community into brighter days, where the citizens would fear neither cold nor hunger, as was often said at general assemblies. Only one thing made him anxious in the quiet moments of evening peace in his office: the rumors from the refugees of an impending storm from the west, which would sweep away the small settlements of the survivors. When he thought of it, his hands involuntarily trembled. Would the city survive? Would it pass the next test? Well, the future would tell.